So welcome to my little presentation on the UI collection view in Xcode and why it is so complicated. It is very complicated. I feel like they could have done this an easier way, but it's super cool. So this might be something useful for you on some project at some point in your life. So when do you want to use a collection view? It's when you want to display an organized array of similar objects. This used to be the kind of thing that in the earlier days of Swift you would have to hack together with like a table view or something like that. But basically it starts out as a table view and then you can change it in all sorts of different really cool ways to display stuff. What is it? It is a kind of view in Xcode. In Xcode, just about anything that you want to put on a storyboard is a view of some kind. Most things they descend from the class of view, and that's just something that displays some kind of information on a screen somewhere. It is a subclass of UICollectionView that manages specifically a collection of ordered items. So you have an internal array of the list of all of your items that you want to display, and it puts them on the screen in whatever way you've defined it to do so. And because it descends from UICollectionView, it scrolls automatically, and anything that you can do with a scroll view, you can also do with a collection view. It's like a UI table view, but instead of being in a table format, you can make a ton of changes to the layout and override any of those functions to make it do basically whatever you want it to do. Each item in your your collection view is a reusable cell. And so what that means is that they are optimized to be reused whenever your cells scroll off your screen. So it'll create however many you need, and then when you scroll further and if you need a new one, it'll make a new one. If you don't need a new one, it will just repopulate an older one. And so you have less stuff in memory to clean up. So you would declare an object of type UI collection reusable view, and that defines kind of their appearance and what goes in them. It used to be for like a table, you'd have specifically headers and footers at the top of the table, but now you've got supplemental views. You can basically make views of any shape and size and however many you want and put them wherever you want, and it lets you do that. So it's pretty, like, because it is so customizable, they can get really complicated. There are basically 4 pieces that you need in your collection view that are defined by different classes or protocols. For the top level, for containment and management of just making sure everything works together, you have the UICollectionView class and the UICollectionView controller class. So the view class will define things about how the view is displayed. You would declare one to say, all right, I'm putting this object here, and you can set all sorts of things about the way it displays that data. The view controller provides the controller level support. It's optional, all of these things. If you don't necessarily, not all of those things, sorry, the view controller, if you don't define your own custom view controller, it just uses the default one. So you could make them completely through storyboards and not do any kind of customization at all, and it'll just work, which is pretty cool. For content management, you've got your data source and your view delegate. The data source manages your content and creates views. The delegate allows you to catch and customize behavior, like selecting and highlighting. So you are using your data source to get all of the data that is going to be populating these fields on your screen. And then you have a delegate, which is by default just does whatever Apple said it does. But you can then overwrite those functions and say, instead of when highlighting things, I want you to go there, I want you to instead shuffle them around, or you can write your own code to do whatever you want on those different actions. And if you want to change its behavior, you'd use the delegate. And then there's the presentation, which is the UI collection reusable view and the UI collection view cell. So the view cell is each thing that gets repeated in your collection view. Each item in the collection is a cell. And the cell class, it descends from UI collection reusable view. So they're all reusable views. You could also have your headers and footers and things like that can be reusable views. And if you want it to work with the delegates and the view controller and things like that, everything that you do has to be a reusable cell. And you can't just use like regular stuff. Because of that, it makes certain things more complicated that I will get to later. But basically, the part where it's the cell or the reusable view, that's the part where you just describe what is in this box, and how does it look. It's just all of the view display stuff.
Do you need to manage the reusability, or does
No.
Apple manage the reusability?
Apple does that for you. So as long as you declare it as reusable, it used to be that you'd have to check and see whenever you're creating a new cell if there's a cell available, use this one, otherwise make a new one. But now it just does that automatically. So as long as you declare it of a type that is a reusable cell, it'll just do that automatically. The layout. So there's the UICollectionView layout, the UICollectionView layout attributes, and the UICollectionView update item. These are all things that describe how the layout works. You can declare something called a flow layout, which I'll get to later, but these are the three pieces that work together to describe how your collection, how your items in your collection are displayed. The layout describes, there's a series of layout attributes, which can be something like the size of the items, their positioning, their rotation in 3D space, their alpha, all these different qualities. And so then in your view layout class, you are setting those attributes in different circumstances. And then you can use the view update item class to say, like, if this data changes, then do something else with it, if you're adding or removing or things like that. And then there's a flow layout, which thankfully makes it a lot simpler in that it's the default kind of layout that you can basically use through Storyboard, where a flow layout is any kind of, it's like a pre-made UICollectionView layout class that defines a lot of behaviors for things that move linearly. So if you want to have a grid, if you want to have a table, anything where it's just like a line of items that do stuff from top to bottom or from left to right, you can just say, I want a flow layout, and you don't have to deal with any of the layout code. So that's pretty convenient. And so I guess that's just like the overview of all the stuff you need in your UICollectionView. For layouts and layout attributes, that's what really makes a UICollectionView cool. That's why you'd want to use one of these instead of something else. For most things that you'd want to do, you can use the default UICollectionView flow layout for anything that's linear, like a graph, like a chart, like anything where one thing comes after the other thing and maybe their sizes change or something like that. You can change all sorts of properties for any given cell. And then you can write code to override parts of that functionality to select cells, supplemental and decorative views, which would be those reusable cells that are not your data. And you can select them by where in the index they are, like in that array of data. On the third, we want the third one to be smaller than the first one, for example. Or you could by their type, if it's this kind of cell, do this. If it's that kind of cell, do that. Or if they fall in a certain rectangle on your screen. So you can make it so that as a user is scrolling, the views in the middle, the collection items in the middle get bigger, and the ones towards the end are smaller, or things like that. And that's just all just by saying, like, when there's a view, and like writing code that basically just says when the cell is in this rectangle, make size equal to something. So it makes it really simple to write that whole kind of complex layout thing and then let Apple handle all of the fiddly bits. So as some examples of things that you could do with a UICollectionView, you could do something that looks very much just like a grid of pictures, but where they're all different sizes. You could do, this is like a calendar of like events that are scheduled on certain days, where each one of those little, sorry, let me just walk around and point at things, where like each one of these little things here is like an item that you could click on and interact with, but you can decide their position and their layout and things like that by altering that layout code. And then this thing, which I think is really neat, just because I think it looks cool, where they just kind of, is it going to do it? Oh, it did it? It's a free, okay, yeah. So like there's a tutorial online where you just do what the guy tells you and it teaches you how to code that up. But it's just like, it lets you browse through each item just by rotating, and they spin in a circle. And it's all some fairly simple code, just interacting with the layout portion of that code to make them do that. I don't know why that would be useful, but it certainly looks neat. So here's an example that I'm going to do using this flow layout. It's for that picture that I had back at the beginning. It's basically going to be a screen that has a little circle with the vegetable in it and then a word on it, and the whole screen is going to be filled with them, and they're all going to be populated. So in order to do that, I'm going to go walk around here. So this is the scene that we're concerned with, the Explore by Crop scene. There's a collection view that you drag in there, and that's just the view itself. In it, there's a decorative view, which is the Explore main background, and that's just the background. It doesn't need to interact with the data in any way, so I don't need to put it in any fancy classes or anything like that. And then there's a cell called a crop type cell, which is this circle here. The rest of that we don't really care about, but those are the three things in the storyboard that I had to drag in there in order to make this happen: is the collection view, whatever decorative stuff, and your crop type cell. So then in the setup portion through the storyboard, what you then do is I'm setting the layout to flow, so I don't have to write all of that code to determine the layout. You can set all sorts of things like you normally would be setting in Xcode for any kind of view, where your scroll style, how is it going horizontally or vertically? You can decide don't make it scroll. How is it bouncing? How is it zoomed in there? How does it interact with the keyboard? Like the alpha, the background, all of that normal stuff you can do just through that screen. Then there's the part where you have to set how big things are. Normally in a storyboard, you could put views on the screen and set their sizes in relation to the sizes of other things. Like you could pin it to the sides of the screen, or say this view is equal to half of the width of the window, or something like that. You can't do that here. Because you're not working with regular views, you're working with these reusable views that are being generated on the fly through that code. You can either set them manually right here and say the cell is going to be 200 by 200 and the header is this big and the scroll view is this big, and you set those numbers manually. Or you have to go into the code at exactly the right time and tell it when to make those changes. So that's a little annoying, but you can do it, and it's good. So here's how you set up the cell itself. Inside, you can use layout constraints within any given cell to tell it how those parts are going to interact with each other. So using the storyboard, I set up this cell right here so that it has the photo of the artichokes. It's got the background tint, which is just a circle of that slightly transparent color, and then the name of the crop. And I was able to, you can't reference the width of the screen or the width of other elements on the screen in there. So that makes it harder to use those constraints, but in relationship to each other, you can. So what I did here was I pinned the background tint to the edges of the cell. I pinned the image to 4 pixels away from the edge of the cell. And then I set the label to have a width equal to the width of the artichoke photo. So the two things that you would need to then set in order to determine what code to use to link your storyboard to your code that you're writing in Swift, you would use the custom class would determine what view class you're using to describe how this is laid out. And then you're using the collection reusable view identifier to, when it is pulling data into your cell and populating your cell, to say what kind of a cell to use. I'll show you how to do that in a second. Okay. So here's the cell called crop type cell. This is a view cell. This is what you'd be writing for any cell that you had, like for any kind of view on your screen. If you wanted to say like have like a profile page where it's like profile photo equals this, profile name equals this. It's that kind of thing where you're just describing how you're going to display stuff on the screen. And all it is I've created 3 IB outlets, one for the background tint view, one for the crop type photo view, and one for the name, the label. And so then you would do that thing where you have on your storyboard, you click on the object and you click and drag it over to your code, control click and drag it over, and then it has this, it links them together. So that now that's all I did in that class. I'm going to then use other classes to set those values depending on what data I get. And then in the crop type collection view controller class, that's the view controller for the entire collection object. What I'm doing is I'm saving the name of the reuse identifier, which would be crop type cell, which is what I assigned, which I typed in on the storyboard. And then when I'm overriding the function of collection view. Like, so when a collection view is instantiated, then for each one in the index path, for each item that it has in that array of data, and it's going to get the data from somewhere, it's going to create a cell of type. You're going to DQ reusable cell with reuse identifier of whatever identifier you want. So you could theoretically create like several different kinds of cells, and in different circumstances, depending on what data you have, DQ a different kind of cell. You could have multiple different kinds working together. In this case, they're all the same. So it's always going to DQ one with the reuse identifier of crop type cell, and then it's setting that, it's setting the text within the cell to whatever it got from the data. It's setting the photo image to creating an image from whatever it says in the data. So these things right here, the cell dot whatever, those are all referencing what I wrote in the cell declaration. So just as an example of how you might do it if you wanted to have two different kinds of cells, this is for an article with a photo, and this is for an article that didn't have a photo. It's pretty similar, but basically, like, so you would, in the storyboards, you'd build them like you would for the other ones, and you would give them a reuse identifier. So this one would be called photo cell, and this one's called event cell. And so then you can say, like, if in the data it says that there is a photo, then create one, then DQ reusable cell with reuse identifier of photo cell. And then otherwise, if it doesn't say that there's a photo here, create one of this type. And so that links it into the storyboard and uses all of that stuff that you set up there. So where do you get your data? There's a lot of different ways that you can do it. Basically, you have to get the data from somewhere and then hand it to the view controller via your data source. You can create an object, and then you can call that, you can declare that to be the data source of your view controller. Or you can use the view controller itself to do that management, but basically you just need to write something that conforms to the protocol of a data source. To conform to a protocol of a data source, it requires that you implement these two methods, which is collection view number of items in section, which describes how many items are there, and collection view cell for item at index path, which says for any point in this array, what's there, what data is there. And so I created a class that was responsible for defining a data structure and populating it from JSON, but then I used the view controller to pull from that data structure the pieces and then put them in the view controller. So I just within the view controller itself, I overrode these two methods. So it conformed to the protocol, and I didn't need to make a separate data source. So this is the JSON. It's basically just like a list of crop types, and you've got an ID, whether it's active, a crop name, a photo. And so I made a structure with a user and an array of results for that user. And then let's see, I defined a class called crop type data, which follows the protocol of equitable, which means that if you implement a method of double equal sign, you could determine if two things were equal to each other. And you have to also have an init method that you pass it a series of pieces of data, and then it populates the thing. So now I have this class of data. And then I have a class called crop type get, which is responsible for getting that data from either the internet or from this JSON file for temporarily, and filling it with data. So I've declared a dictionary, and if it can't find it, it throws an error. It basically just all this part does is it's searching through that JSON file and then pulling those pieces apart and storing them in a crop type data file that has a thumbnail, a name, an ID, and a photo name. And then there's a crop type results is just one encapsulated structure which has a user and an array of these results. And that's what we're going to grab from our view controller. Back in the view controller here, view did load is the function that is automatically called on any view as soon as it is loaded by the user. It executes anything that's in there. So you have the super view did load, which does whatever Apple automatically does. And then I'm calling if crop types list ready, then print we did it. Otherwise, just error handling. So crop types list ready, it calls that get crop types for user from that item that I declared. And then it goes through the results. And if there's something, then it populates an internal structure called crop types that is then used from the collection view to reload the data. We implement the functions that you need to override that protocol to count the number of items and to populate the solid index path. So for here, we've got for number of items in section, it just counts the number of items in that array that we have there. And then for the one that says for cell at index path, that's the part I was showing you a few slides ago, where you have your reuse identifier, where you decide where it's looking at that data that was stored in that array. And then if the data is of a type with a photo, or in this case, they're all the same, you're going to DQ reusable cell with reuse identifier of whatever you assigned it on the storyboard. And then it's populating the text, the image, and the frame from that data. And then it's just returning the cell. So now that I have that overridden, then it all goes over to the layout. Since we on the storyboard clicked flow layout, I don't really have to do anything else in order to make it work. It's just going to automatically make a bunch of those cells with the sizes that it said to do, with the data and the cells displaying using the view controller. But like I said before, you cannot set the size of your cells using constraints because it is getting its information on what size it is from from the delegate flow layout, or from the delegate layout if you are not using a flow layout. So you can then override that information by writing an extension in your view controller. So here I'm letting this, I took the screen width and then I said let the width of the crop type width equal to 1/3 of the screen width and the height equal to whatever that was, and then return the size of those two fields. Sorry, so that's for the function of like the collection view size for item at index path, which is supposed to return a CG size. So you can override that and say, okay, I'm deciding how big it's going to be. You could also, there's also a function for the inset for section at index whatever. You can set your own section insets instead of setting it through the inspector by overriding that function and then setting up your own section insets. So I just said 50, but I'm assuming that at some point I might need to make it a different distance from the top depending on different screen sizes. So I have this here so that I can make that calculation there if I need to. So that's where you would do any kind of changes that you wanted to your layout. And that's it. Once you have all those pieces together, you have a collection view that does cool stuff when you interact with it. So what else could you do with this? You could, in this example, there's a tutorial you can follow online to dynamically resize cells to fit whatever content's in them. So that is making changes to the layout part of the code where you're looking at what's in each cell and then resizing them based on that. You could animate cells from beginning to ending positions. There's that chunk of it where you're on cell data did change within the flow layout, where you can say, okay, anytime any changes are made to my data, I'm going to shrink a cell down and put more stuff in it and pop it up in the front. As things update from a different location, you can have things animating and moving wherever you need them to go. You can, because it descends from a UI scroll class, you can change the way that the screen responds to scrolling or the way it responds to gestures. You could add, I only added a background, but you can add all sorts of decorative and supplemental views. So a lot of people, when they're trying to make it like I'm making if you want to make a a bookcase that has real books on it or something. You can create a bookcase using decorative views and then have books that you populate from your data. And then as data changes, you can change your stuff. So because they created all of this functionality and then said, all right, overwrite the parts of it you need. You can kind of customize it to do a lot of really neat stuff. I hope that you can use this in some of your projects. Thank you for listening.